Sometimes the most desperate decisions lead to the most unexpected discoveries. What began as a young woman's last hope for survival in 1892, Montana became a test of human resilience that would challenge everything she believed about marriage, family, and the true meaning of home. This isn't just about finding shelter from a brutal winter. It's about discovering that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from standing alone, but from learning to share space with someone who should have been your enemy before we jump. Back in? Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind cut through the railroad car like shards of broken glass, carrying with it the bitter promise of Montana's infamous winter. Catherine Wells pressed her face against the frost-covered window, watching the endless expanse of snow-covered prairie roll past in monotonous waves. Her breath fogged the glass as she traced nervous patterns with her gloved fingertip, a habit she'd developed during the 3 long days since leaving Chicago. At 24, Catherine had learned to pack light and travel lighter. Everything she owned in the world fit into a single carpet bag tucked beneath her feet. 2 worn dresses, a faded photograph of her deceased parents, her mother's wedding ring wrapped in tissue paper, and exactly $37 in carefully counted bills. The train ticket to Copper Falls had cost $28, leaving her with barely enough for a meal, let alone lodging once she arrived. She pulled the letter from her coat pocket for what must have been the 100th time since leaving Illinois. The paper was soft from repeated handling, creased along the fold lines where she'd opened and closed it, obsessively. Written in a strong, masculine hand, it contained the response to her advertisement in the matrimonial section of the Chicago Tribune, the advertisement that had been her last desperate attempt to escape a situation that had become impossible. "Miss Wells," the letter began, "I am in need of a wife to help manage my homestead outside Copper Falls, Montana. I'm 31 years old, own 160 acres of good grazing land, and can provide a comfortable home for the right woman. I seek someone of good character who is not afraid of hard work and frontier life. If you are willing to consider marriage to a stranger based on mutual respect and practical partnership, please respond with your travel arrangements." It was signed simply Thomas Mitchell, Copper Falls, Montana Territory. Catherine had responded immediately, driven by circumstances that left her no other choice. The textile factory where she'd worked for 6 years had closed permanently, throwing hundreds of women onto the streets with no prospects and dwindling savings. Her boarding house landlady had been patient for 2 months, but patience didn't pay rent, and Catherine's room would be needed for paying tenants by month's end. The matrimonial advertisements had seemed like madness when she first considered them, traveling hundreds of miles to marry a complete stranger based on nothing more than exchanged letters. But desperation had a way of making the impossible seem reasonable, and Thomas Mitchell's letter had offered something Catherine hadn't had in years: security and purpose. Their subsequent correspondence had been brief but encouraging. Thomas had explained that his homestead was isolated but self-sufficient, with a main house, barn, and enough livestock to provide a modest but comfortable living. He'd lost his parents to influenza the previous winter and needed a partner to help manage the property and prepare for the harsh Montana seasons. Catherine had been honest about her circumstances: the factory closure, her lack of family, her willingness to work hard in exchange for a stable home. What she hadn't mentioned, because it seemed irrelevant to a practical arrangement, was the growing sense of loneliness that had consumed her since her parents' deaths 5 years earlier. The factory girls had been friendly enough, but friendships formed over looms, and lunch pails rarely extended beyond the workplace. Catherine had spent too many evenings in her cramped boarding house room, listening to the sounds of other people's lives through thin walls, while wondering if she was destined to remain forever on the periphery of belonging. Thomas's letters had suggested a man who understood the practical necessities of frontier life without romantic delusions. His proposal was straightforward: a working partnership that might grow into genuine affection over time, but began with mutual respect and shared responsibilities. It was exactly what Catherine had convinced herself she wanted: no messy emotions, no unrealistic expectations, just two people working together toward common goals. The train shuddered to a stop at a depot that looked like little more than a wooden platform surrounded by endless white wilderness. Catherine gathered her belongings and stepped onto the platform, immediately gasping as the Montana air hit her lungs like ice water. The cold was unlike anything she'd experienced in Chicago, dry and sharp, and so intense it made her eyes water. The depot consisted of a small building that served as ticket office, waiting room, and telegraph station. A handful of other passengers disembarked, quickly disappearing into the warmth of the building or being met by people with heavy coats and determined expressions. Catherine stood alone on the platform, scanning the area for someone who might be Thomas Mitchell. She'd expected him to meet the train, but as the minutes passed and the platform emptied, uncertainty began to creep in. Had there been a miscommunication about her arrival date? Was he delayed by weather or ranch business? The possibility that he'd simply changed his mind and decided not to meet her sent panic shooting through her chest. "Miss Wells," the voice. It came from behind her, deep and slightly hesitant. Catherine turned to see a man approaching from the depot building. He was tall and lean, with dark hair visible beneath a worn hat and a beard that couldn't quite hide the angular planes of his face. His clothes marked him as a working man: heavy coat, sturdy boots, hands that showed the calluses of physical labor. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, brown and serious, with a wariness that suggested recent disappointments. "Mr. Mitchell," she replied, extending her hand in what she hoped was a confident gesture. Thomas removed his hat and shook her hand briefly, his grip firm but impersonal. "Welcome to Montana, Miss Wells. I apologize for the delay. Had to load supplies before the storm hits. We need to get moving before the road becomes impassable." His wagon was loaded with sacks of grain, tools, and various supplies that spoke of careful preparation for winter isolation. Thomas helped Catherine up to the passenger seat, then secured her carpet bag among the other cargo. As they pulled away from the depot, Catherine got her first real look at the landscape that would be her new home. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by distant mountain ranges that looked like teeth against the gray sky. Snow covered everything, creating a monochrome world that was both beautiful and slightly terrifying in its vastness. The road they followed was little more than wagon ruts through the prairie, marked by occasional fence posts that disappeared into the white distance. "How far to your homestead?" Catherine asked, pulling her coat tighter against the wind. "About 12 miles, Thomas replied, his attention focused on guiding the horses through increasingly deep snow. "Should make it before dark if the weather holds." They rode in relative silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the steady breathing of the horses. Catherine found herself stealing glances at the man who would soon be her husband, trying to reconcile his physical presence with the practical, straightforward tone of his letters. There was something guarded about him, a reserve that went beyond normal caution with strangers. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled, the flat prairie giving way to rolling hills dotted with clusters of pine trees. Catherine began to see signs of human habitation: distant smoke from homestead chimneys, occasional cattle clustered around hay piles, the geometric lines of fenced pastures. It was isolated country, but not empty, and that gave her some comfort. "Tell me about your neighbors," she said, wanting to break the silence that was becoming uncomfortable. Thomas was quiet for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. "Closest neighbors are the Andersons, about 3 miles east. Good people, been helpful when I needed extra hands during harvest. The Brennans live 5 miles south. They've got the largest operation in the area. Most folks keep to themselves. During winter, but come spring there are barn raisings, church socials, that sort of thing." Catherine nodded, filing away the information while continuing to study the man beside her. His answers were informative, but somehow incomplete, as if he was editing his responses carefully. She was beginning to sense that Thomas Mitchell harbored secrets beneath his straightforward exterior. The snow began falling more heavily as afternoon faded toward evening, the flakes large and wet with the promise of a serious storm. Thomas urged the horses to a faster pace, his expression growing increasingly concerned as he scanned the darkening sky. "Storm's moving in faster than I expected," he said, more to himself than to Catherine. "We'll need to push hard to beat it home." Home! The word sent a mixture of anticipation and anxiety through Catherine's chest. In a few hours, she would be living in a house with a man she'd never seen before today, committed to a marriage that existed only on paper, but would soon become legal reality. The practical arrangement that had seemed so sensible in their letters suddenly felt overwhelming in its implications. The homestead appeared gradually through the swirling snow. First the barn, a solid structure that spoke of good craftsmanship and careful maintenance. Then the main house, larger than Catherine had expected, with smoke rising from the chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. The sight was welcoming after hours of traveling through increasingly hostile weather. Thomas pulled the wagon up to the front porch and jumped down, immediately beginning to unload the most essential supplies. "Get inside and warm up," he told Catherine. "I need to get the horses settled and the perishables stored before this storm gets worse." Catherine climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the long ride, and made her way to the front door. She hesitated with her hand on the latch, suddenly uncertain about entering uninvited. This would be her home, but it didn't feel like a home yet. It felt like trespassing. She pushed open the door and stepped into warmth that was immediately welcoming after hours in the cold. The main room was larger than she'd expected, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and furniture that looked handmade but comfortable. A kitchen area occupied the far end of the room, and she could see doorways leading to what were probably bedrooms. But it was the evidence of careful domestic management that caught Catherine's attention. Curtains at the windows, rugs on the floor, kitchen shelves organized with the precision of someone who knew where everything belonged. The house didn't look like a bachelor's residence. It looked like a place where a woman had lived and worked and made a home. Catherine was examining a particularly fine quilt draped over the back of a chair when she heard footsteps on the porch. She turned toward the door, expecting to see Thomas, but instead found herself face to face with a woman who looked as shocked to see Catherine as Catherine was to see her. The woman was probably in her late 20s, with auburn hair pinned back practically but attractively, and green eyes that were currently wide with surprise. She wore a simple dress covered by an apron, and her hands were dusted with flour as if she'd been interrupted in the middle of baking. She was, Catherine realized with growing horror, exactly what a rancher's wife should look like: competent, settled and completely at home in surroundings that Catherine had been expecting to claim as her own. "Who are you?" the woman asked, her voice carrying more confusion than hostility. Before Catherine could answer, Thomas burst through the door, stomping snow off his boots and shaking ice from his coat. He looked from Catherine to the other woman, and his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, and something that might have been panic. "Margaret," he said finally, his voice strained. "You're supposed to be in town until spring, Margaret. The name hit Catherine like a physical blow. Margaret, who clearly belonged in this house in ways Catherine never would. Margaret, who was looking at Thomas with the familiarity of shared history and intimate knowledge. The roads became impassable earlier than expected, Margaret replied, her gaze moving between Thomas and Catherine with growing understanding. Dr. Hamilton thought it would be safer if I returned to the homestead rather than risk being stranded in town. She paused, studying Catherine's traveling clothes and obvious confusion. Thomas, who is this woman? Thomas removed his hat and ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that spoke of a man realizing he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. Margaret, this is Catherine Wells. She's come from Chicago to marry you, Catherine finished, her voice barely above a whisper. The practical arrangement that had seemed so reasonable in their correspondence was suddenly revealed as something much more complicated. Margaret stared at Catherine for a long moment, then turned to Thomas with an expression that mixed hurt, anger, and something that might have been dark amusement. You got yourself a mail-order bride, Thomas. How wonderfully practical of you. The sarcasm in her tone cut through the room like a blade, making Catherine feel like an intruder in a domestic drama she didn't understand. Thomas looked like a man caught between two impossible choices, his face pale beneath his winter tan. Margaret, I thought you were staying in town until the baby was born, he said quietly. The doctor said it would be safer. The baby, Catherine repeated, the words barely audible. Her gaze dropped automatically to Margaret's midsection, noting for the first time the slight roundness beneath her apron that spoke of early pregnancy. Margaret's hand moved protectively to her stomach, and Catherine saw the glint of a wedding ring on her finger, a wedding ring that matched the simple gold band Thomas wore on his own hand. The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the sound of wind building to a howl outside. Catherine stood frozen in the middle of the space, understanding, with crystalline clarity, that she'd traveled 800 miles to become the third party in a marriage that was apparently very much still intact. I think, Margaret said with forced calm, we all need to sit down and discuss this situation like civilized people. But even as she spoke, the wind outside reached a new intensity, rattling the windows and sending snow against the glass in sheets that blocked any view of the outside world. The storm that had been threatening all day had arrived with a vengeance, and Catherine realized with growing horror that she was trapped until spring in a house with a man who was already married to someone else. Her practical arrangement had just become the most complicated situation of her life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence stretched between the three of them like a taut wire ready to snap. Outside, the storm had transformed from threatening to violent, with wind that screamed around the corners of the house and snow that pelted the windows with the persistence of thrown gravel. The warmth of the fireplace seemed insignificant against the reality that none of them could leave this house until spring. Margaret was the first to move, setting down a wooden spoon she'd been holding and wiping, her flour-dusted hands on her apron with deliberate precision. Her movements were controlled, but Catherine could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she held herself that suggested someone fighting to maintain composure. I'll make coffee, Margaret announced, her voice steady despite the circumstances. This conversation requires clear heads. Thomas finally found his voice, though it came out rough and uncertain. Margaret, I can explain. Oh, I'm sure you can, Margaret interrupted, moving toward the kitchen area without looking at either of them. You always were good with explanations, Thomas. Sit down, both of you. This may take a while. Catherine remained frozen in the center of the room, her carpetbag still clutched in her hand like a shield. The practical part of her mind noted details about the house, the careful arrangement of furniture, the hand-sewn cushions, the way everything seemed to have a designated place. This was a home that had been built by two people working together, not the bachelor's residence Thomas had described in his letters. "Catherine," Thomas said quietly, gesturing toward one of the chairs near the fireplace. "Please sit down. I owe you both an explanation." She moved stiffly to the indicated chair, perching on its edge, as if ready to flee at any moment. Thomas took the chair across from her, running his hands through his hair in what was clearly a habitual gesture of stress. In the firelight, she could see lines around his eyes that spoke of recent hardship, and a tension in his jaw that suggested this conversation was one he'd been dreading. Margaret worked at the stove with practiced efficiency, measuring coffee and water with the automatic movements of someone who'd performed the task countless times. But Catherine noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the way she kept her back turned longer than necessary. Whatever composure she was maintaining came at considerable cost. "How long have you been married?" Catherine asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Thomas looked up sharply, meeting her eyes for the first time since Margaret's arrival. 3 years this past September." 3 years. Catherine repeated the words as if testing their weight. "And in all your letters, you never once mentioned having a wife, because I thought she was dead." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that seemed to reach every corner. Margaret's hands stilled at the stove, and Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat. "Dead?" Catherine whispered. Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring into the fire as if it might provide answers to impossible questions. "There was an accident last spring. Margaret was helping Dr. Hamilton in town during a typhoid outbreak. She was exposed to the disease and—" He paused, swallowing hard. "She collapsed. Dr. Hamilton said she'd died. I saw her body myself, covered with a sheet in his office. I buried what I thought was my wife in the town cemetery." Margaret finally turned from the stove, her face pale but her eyes blazing with an emotion Catherine couldn't quite identify. "Except it wasn't me you buried, was it, Thomas?" "No," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "It was Sarah Chen, the Chinese woman who'd been helping Dr. Hamilton. She died the same night, around the same time, in the chaos of the outbreak, with bodies wrapped for burial." He shook his head. "Hamilton was exhausted, making mistakes. When I came to identify Margaret's body, he showed me Sarah instead." Catherine struggled to process the information. "But how did no one realize the mistake?" Margaret poured coffee into 3 cups, her movement sharp with controlled anger. "Because I was in a coma for 6 weeks. When I finally woke up, Dr. Hamilton was so shocked he nearly had an attack himself. By then, Thomas had already buried someone else, thinking it was me, and I was too weak to travel home until now." She set a cup in front of Catherine, then Thomas, keeping the third for herself. The coffee was strong and bitter, matching the mood that had settled over the room like smoke. "Why didn't you send word when you recovered?" Catherine asked. "Why let him think you were dead all this time?" Thomas answered before Margaret could speak. "She did send word. I got a telegram 3 months ago, but I thought it was someone's idea of a cruel joke. People sometimes—" He gestured helplessly. "Grief makes you suspicious of hope. I convinced myself it was a mistake, or someone trying to take advantage of a widower." Margaret's laugh was sharp and humorless. "So instead of investigating, instead of coming to town to see for yourself, you decided to order a replacement wife from Chicago." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd been reduced to a replacement, a mail-order substitute for a woman who'd never actually died. The humiliation was almost unbearable. "It wasn't like that," Thomas protested, but his words lacked conviction. "Wasn't it?" Margaret challenged. Tell me, Thomas, what exactly did you tell Miss Wells about your circumstances? Did you mention that you'd been married, that you had a wife you thought was dead, or did you present yourself as a lifelong bachelor looking for a convenient partnership? Catherine found her voice, though it came out stronger than she felt. He said he'd lost his parents to influenza and needed help managing the homestead. He never mentioned a wife, living or dead. Margaret nodded grimly, as if this confirmed her suspicions. How very practical of you, Thomas. Why complicate things with inconvenient truths? Thomas stood abruptly, walking to the window where the storm continued its assault on the glass. I was trying to start over. I thought you were gone, that I'd never see you again. The loneliness was... He turned back to face them, his expression raw with pain. This place was haunted. Every room, every corner reminded me of what I'd lost. I couldn't bear it anymore. So you decided to fill the house with someone new, Margaret said quietly. Someone who didn't know about the ghosts. Catherine set down her coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly. This explains why the house looked so settled, so feminine. I wondered why a bachelor's home felt so much like a place where a woman lived. Because I did live here, Margaret said simply. For 3 years, I made this house a home. I sewed those curtains, braided those rugs, planted the herb garden that's probably buried under snow right now. Every domestic touch you see came from my hands, my labor, my love for this place and the man who built it. The weight of Margaret's words settled over Catherine like a blanket made of lead. She was sitting in another woman's home, surrounded by the evidence of a life and love that had never actually ended, only been interrupted by circumstances beyond anyone's control. What happens now? Catherine asked, voicing the question that hung over all of them. Thomas returned to his chair, looking older than his 31 years. I don't know. Legally, Margaret is my wife. Our marriage never ended, was never dissolved. But Catherine... He looked at her with something that might have been sympathy. You came here in good faith based on my representations. You have rights in this situation too. What rights? Catherine laughed bitterly. The right to be humiliated, the right to discover I've traveled 800 miles to become an intruder in someone else's marriage? The right to shelter until spring, Margaret said firmly, surprising both Catherine and Thomas. Whatever else has happened here, you're not going out in this storm. No one deserves to freeze to death because of my husband's poor judgment. Catherine stared at Margaret, searching for sarcasm or hidden malice, but finding only a grim determination. You'd let me stay, even though I came here to marry your husband? You came here under false pretenses, Margaret corrected. Not false. On your part, but on his. You're as much a victim of this situation as I am. Thomas looked between the two women with something approaching desperation. There has to be a solution that works for everyone. The homestead is large enough... For what? Margaret interrupted. For you to maintain 2 wives? For us to take turns warming your bed? Exactly what arrangement did you have in mind, Thomas? The crudeness of her words made Catherine flinch, but she could see the pain behind Margaret's anger. This woman had awakened from a weeks-long coma to discover that her husband had not only given her up for dead, but actively sought to replace her. I meant separate arrangements, Thomas said stiffly. Catherine could have the small bedroom, help with the household tasks and ranch work in exchange for room and board until spring. When the road's clear, she could return to Chicago or find other arrangements. Other arrangements, Catherine repeated. You mean find another husband, another man willing to marry a woman who's already been humiliated by one matrimonial disaster. The reality of her situation was becoming clearer with each passing moment. Even if she could return to Chicago in the spring, what would she return to? Her job was gone, her room was forfeit, and her reputation would be in ruins once word spread that she'd traveled west to marry a man who was already married. The matrimonial agencies that facilitated such arrangements depended on discretion and success stories, not scandals. Margaret studied Catherine's face with surprising sympathy. "You have no family back east? No one who could help you start over?" "No one," Catherine admitted. "My parents died 5 years ago. I have some distant cousins in Ohio, but we haven't corresponded in years. They wouldn't welcome a disgraced relative arriving on their doorstep." The three of them sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts, while the storm continued its relentless assault outside. The coffee grew cold in their cups, but none of them seemed to notice. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice thoughtful and measured. "I have a proposal." Both Thomas and Catherine looked at her expectantly. "We all stay here until spring, as Thomas suggested, but not as some awkward arrangement where Catherine serves as an unpaid domestic while I reclaim my position as wife. We share the work, we share the responsibilities, and we figure out how to coexist without killing each other." "What about—" Thomas began, then stopped, apparently unsure how to phrase his question. "What about our marriage?" Margaret finished. "That's something you and I need to discuss privately. But regardless of what we decide about our future, Catherine deserves to be treated as an equal partner in this arrangement, not as hired help or a charity case." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. "Why would you do that for me? You have every right to hate me for coming here." Margaret's smile was sad but genuine. "Because I understand what it's like to have your life turned upside down by circumstances beyond your control. Because you didn't create this situation, Thomas did. And because—" She paused, looking around, the room that had been her home. "Because maybe I need time to figure out who I am now, too. 6 months in town, recovering from an illness that nearly killed me, changes a person. I'm not the same woman who collapsed in Dr. Hamilton's office." Thomas looked between the two women with an expression of bewildered relief. "You're both willing to try this, to live together until spring." "I don't see that we have much choice," Catherine said practically. "The storm has made the decision for us. We're stuck here whether we like it or not." "Then we make the best of it," Margaret declared, with the tone of a woman accustomed to making difficult decisions. "But there will be rules, clear boundaries and expectations for everyone." As if to emphasize the point, the wind outside reached a new level of intensity, howling around the house like a living thing determined to break down the walls that sheltered them. Catherine realized that the storm trapping them together might be the least of their challenges. They were about to embark on an experiment in human cooperation that would test every assumption they had about marriage, survival, and the complicated ways people learned to live together when circumstances left them no other choice. The longest winter of their lives was just beginning. The storm raged for 3 days, turning the world outside into a howling wilderness of white. Inside the Mitchell homestead, an entirely different kind of tempest was brewing, as 3 people tried to establish boundaries in a space that had never been designed for such complicated arrangements. Margaret had claimed the master bedroom without discussion, her few belongings from town already arranged on the dresser that had once held her wedding photograph alongside Thomas's. Catherine was given the smaller bedroom that Thomas had originally intended as a guest room, its single window offering a view of the barn where Thomas now slept among the hay bales and horse blankets. "It's temporary," Thomas had insisted the first night, shouldering his bedroll and extra quilts. "Just until we figure out better arrangements." "Don't be ridiculous," Margaret had replied coolly. "You built this house. You shouldn't be exiled to the barn. The parlor sofa is perfectly adequate for sleeping, and the fireplace will keep you warm." But Thomas had shaken his head, his jaw set with stubborn determination. "I won't sleep under The same roof with two women, when one of them came here expecting to be my wife, and the other is my wife, who thought I'd betrayed her memory. The barn is fine." Catherine had watched this exchange with growing discomfort, realizing that her presence had turned what should have been a joyful reunion into an exercise in careful navigation around explosive emotions. Every interaction between Margaret and Thomas crackled with unspoken tensions, hurt feelings, wounded pride, and the complicated grief of people who'd mourned each other unnecessarily. By the second morning, when the wind had died down enough to allow Thomas back into the house for meals, Margaret had established what she called the schedule. She'd written it out in her careful penmanship and tacked it to the kitchen wall beside the window. Breakfast, Margaret, 6 a.m. lunch, Catherine, 12 p.m. Dinner, alternate days. Kitchen cleanup, whoever didn't cook laundry, Mondays, Catherine, Thursdays. Margaret mending, evenings by firelight, both livestock feeding Thomas. Morning and evening barn maintenance, Thomas household repairs, Thomas medical care, Margaret, Dr. Hamilton's training. Catherine had studied the schedule with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. Margaret's organizational skills were impressive, but the rigid structure felt like an attempt to impose order on a situation that was inherently chaotic. "What about personal time?" Catherine had asked. "Time when we're not working or sharing common spaces?" Margaret had looked up from the bread dough she was kneading with perhaps more force than necessary. "Personal time happens in your bedroom. Everywhere else is shared space, which means we all have to coexist civilly." The civility was proving more challenging than any of them had anticipated. On the third morning, Catherine was preparing lunch when she opened the pantry to find it meticulously organized with labels written in Margaret's neat handwriting. Every jar, every sack of flour or beans, every preserved vegetable had its designated place and its contents clearly marked. "She's always been like that," Thomas said quietly from behind her. Catherine startled. She hadn't heard him come in from the barn. "Margaret believes organization can solve any problem." Catherine pulled out ingredients for soup, noting how Margaret had arranged items by frequency of use and alphabetical order. "It's very efficient. It's her way of controlling what she can when everything else feels unpredictable," Thomas continued, warming his hands over the coffee pot. "When we first married, I thought it was charming. Now I'm not sure if she's organizing the pantry or trying to organize her feelings about this whole situation." Catherine began chopping vegetables, grateful for a task that didn't require her to look at Thomas directly. Conversations with him had become increasingly awkward as they all tried to navigate the strange territory of forced intimacy without actual intimacy. "Can I ask you something?" she said, keeping her voice low in case Margaret was within earshot. Thomas nodded, settling into a chair at the kitchen table, where he could watch both the door and Catherine's preparations. "In your letters, you mentioned being lonely after her parents died, but you never wrote about grief for a wife. How could you separate those feelings so completely?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Catherine began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion she'd rarely heard from him. Because the grief for Margaret was so much bigger than loneliness. It was like having a limb torn off. "The loneliness after my parents died was sad, but manageable. The grief for Margaret was something that made me question whether I wanted to keep living at all." Catherine's knife stilled against the cutting board. "But you did keep living. You reached out to find someone new." "I reached out because I realized I was disappearing," Thomas admitted. "This house was becoming a shrine to someone I thought was dead. I was talking to her picture, setting a place for her at meals, leaving her clothes in the wardrobe because I couldn't bear to pack them away. I needed someone real, someone alive, someone who could help me remember how to be a living person instead of a ghost." The honesty in his voice made Catherine's chest tight with unexpected sympathy. She'd thought of Thomas as the villain in this situation, the man who'd misrepresented his circumstances and created an impossible triangle. But listening to him describe the depth of his grief, she began to understand that he'd been as much a victim of circumstances as anyone else. "And now?" she asked quietly. "Now that she's alive and here?" "Now I don't know what I am," Thomas said, simply. The man who grieved for her was different from the man who married her. The man who wrote to you was different from both of them. I feel like I'm trying to figure out which version of myself actually exists. Their conversation was interrupted by Margaret's entrance from the parlour, where she'd been mending socks by the better light of the large window. She took in the scene, Thomas at the table, Catherine at the stove, the intimate quality of their quiet conversation, and Catherine saw something flash across her face too quickly to interpret. "Lunch will be ready soon," Catherine said, perhaps more brightly than necessary. "Good," Margaret replied, settling into the chair across from Thomas. "We need to discuss supplies." She produced a piece of paper covered with neat columns of numbers and calculations. "I've been inventorying our stores against the length of winter we're likely to face. If this storm pattern continues, we could be isolated until April." Thomas leaned forward to study her figures. "That's longer than usual. Doctor, Hamilton mentioned that several old-timers were predicting a harsh winter based on early snow patterns and animal behavior. If they're right, we need to be more careful with rationing than we'd planned for 3 people. Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "Are you saying there isn't enough food?" "I'm saying there's enough if we're careful," Margaret replied. "But no room for waste or poor planning. Every meal needs to be calculated to stretch our supplies while maintaining adequate nutrition." She'd worked out portion sizes, protein requirements, and vitamin needs with the precision of someone who'd learned medical basics during her time helping Dr. Hamilton. The level of detail was both impressive and sobering. "What about hunting?" Catherine asked. "Couldn't that supplement our stores?" Thomas and Margaret exchanged a look that carried some communication Catherine couldn't decipher. "Hunting in winter conditions is dangerous," Thomas said carefully. "And with the storm patterns we've been having, game will be scarce and unpredictable." "What he's not saying," Margaret added, "is that hunting means leaving us alone for extended periods, sometimes overnight. Given our unusual circumstances, that might create complications." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks as she understood the implication. Margaret was concerned about leaving Catherine alone with Thomas, or perhaps about being left alone with Catherine. The triangle they'd created wasn't just emotionally complicated, it was practically problematic in ways none of them had fully considered. "I could learn to hunt," Catherine offered, though the idea terrified her. "Or to trap small game near the house." Thomas shook his head firmly. "Winter hunting isn't something you learn quickly, especially not in Montana. It's dangerous work that requires years of experience." "So we're completely dependent on what we already have," Catherine said, studying Margaret's careful calculations. "For the next 4 months, unless we can find other ways to supplement our food supply," Margaret agreed. "I know some techniques for extending meat through smoking and preserving, and there are emergency foods, tree bark, certain roots, that can provide nutrition if we become desperate." The conversation was interrupted by a sound from outside that made all 3 of them freeze. Through the howling wind came the unmistakable noise of someone shouting, followed by what sounded like frantic banging on the barn door. Thomas was on his feet instantly, grabbing his heavy coat from its peg. "Someone's out there." "In this storm?" Margaret asked incredulously. "That's suicide." But the shouting continued, clearly human and clearly in distress. Thomas wrapped a rope around his waist, tying the other end to the solid kitchen table. "If I get disoriented in the snow, pull me back in. He disappeared into the white chaos outside, following the rope toward the barn. Catherine and Margaret stood at the window, trying to peer through the swirling snow for any sign of movement. The wind was so strong it made the house shake, and Catherine couldn't imagine what could have driven someone to venture out in such conditions. Minutes passed before they saw Thomas returning, the rope taut with extra weight. He was half carrying, half dragging a figure bundled in snow-covered clothes. Margaret rushed to open the door as Thomas hauled his burden across the threshold. The newcomer collapsed on the kitchen floor, gasping and shivering violently. Margaret immediately knelt beside the figure, checking for signs of frostbite, while Catherine fetched blankets and hot coffee. "It's Ben Anderson," Thomas said, pulling off the man's frozen outer clothes. "He must have tried to make it here from his place." Ben Anderson was barely conscious, his lips blue with cold and his hands white with what looked like serious frostbite. Margaret worked over him with efficient competence, calling for warm water and clean cloths while checking his breathing and pulse. "Why would he risk traveling in this storm?" Catherine asked, helping Margaret wrap the man in heated blankets. Thomas's expression was grim as he examined Ben's condition. "Ben wouldn't leave his homestead unless it was a real emergency. Something's happened." As Margaret worked to warm Ben back to consciousness, Catherine felt a new kind of dread settling over the already complicated household. Whatever had driven their neighbor out into a killer storm was serious enough to risk death. And if it was serious enough to affect the Anderson homestead, it might be serious enough to threaten them as well. The isolation that had seemed like their biggest challenge was about to become much more complicated. They weren't just three people learning to coexist through a long winter. They were about to become a refuge for problems they couldn't yet imagine. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but inside, the real test of their ability to work together was just beginning. Ben Anderson's eyes fluttered open just as Margaret finished bandaging his frostbitten fingers. His face was gaunt with exhaustion and something deeper, a haunted quality that spoke of witnessing horrors no amount of frontier hardship could prepare someone for. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracked and desperate. "I have to get back to Sarah." Margaret leaned forward, her medical training taking precedence over social awkwardness. "Ben, you're at the Mitchell place. You nearly died getting here. Tell us what happened." Ben struggled to sit up, his movements clumsy from the lingering effects of hypothermia. "Fire," he managed. "The roof caught during the storm. Sarah's trapped in the root cellar with the baby. I couldn't get her out alone." Thomas was already reaching for his coat before Ben finished speaking. "How long ago?" "Hours. Maybe 6 hours?" I lost track. Ben grabbed Thomas's arm with his good hand. The support beam fell across the cellar door. "It'll take at least 2. Meant to lift it, maybe 3. Catherine felt her stomach drop. A woman and baby trapped underground while a fire raged above. Even if they'd survived the initial collapse, they could be suffocating or freezing to death while Ben struggled through. "The storm to find help." "The storm's too dangerous," Margaret said firmly. "You barely made it here alive, and you know these roads better than anyone. Thomas would never make it to your place and back." "I can't leave them," Ben said, trying to stand despite his obvious weakness. "Sarah's my wife. Emma's just 8 months old." The desperation in his voice cut through Catherine like a knife. She thought about her own journey to this isolated place, driven by circumstances that had seemed impossible to overcome. Sarah Anderson was facing something infinitely worse, trapped with her infant daughter while her husband risked everything to find help that might arrive too late. "There has to be a way," Catherine said, though she had no idea what that way might be. Thomas stood at the window, studying the storm with the calculating eye of someone who'd survived many Montana winters. The wind's shifting, coming more from the northwest now instead of straight out of the west. That might create a partial windbreak along the creek bottom route. Might isn't good enough, Margaret replied sharply. If you get lost or injured trying to reach the Anderson place, we'll have 4 people in trouble instead of 2. 3 people, Ben corrected quietly. If I don't make it back by tomorrow, Sarah will try to break out of that cellar herself. She won't just sit there and wait to die. Catherine saw the terrible calculation playing out in everyone's minds. The storm was deadly, but waiting might be more deadly. Sarah Anderson was trapped with limited air and no heat, while her husband grew weaker with every passing hour. What if we don't go to their place? Catherine asked suddenly. What if we bring them here? The 3 others turned to stare at her as if she'd suggested something impossible. Think about it, Catherine continued, the idea gaining clarity as she spoke. Ben knows exactly where they are and what needs to be done to free them. But he's too weak to make the journey alone, and Thomas doesn't know the specific situation well enough to handle it without guidance. I'm not following, Margaret said. Ben guides Thomas to the Anderson place. They free Sarah and the baby together. Then all 4 of them come back here instead of trying to repair the Anderson homestead in winter conditions. Thomas was nodding slowly, working through the logistics. The Anderson place will be uninhabitable anyway if the roof burned. They'd need to shelter somewhere through spring. You're talking about adding 3 more people to our food stores, Margaret pointed out. I already calculated that we're operating at the margin with current numbers. Catherine felt the weight of Margaret's practical concerns, but she also saw the human reality behind the numbers. Then we figure out how to make it work. We hunt more. We forage. We stretch what we have. We don't leave a woman and baby to die because it's inconvenient. Ben was looking at Catherine with something approaching wonder. You'd do that? Take in 3 strangers and share your winter supplies? You're not strangers, Catherine replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. You're neighbors, and neighbors help each other survive. Margaret stood abruptly, walking to her carefully organized pantry. She pulled down several jars and sacks, studying their contents, with the focused attention of someone making critical calculations. 5 adults and 1 infant, she said finally, through April, possibly into May if spring comes late. She paused, running numbers in her head. We'd need to cut portions by roughly 20% and supplement with whatever additional protein Thomas can provide through hunting and fishing. Can it be done? Thomas asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her medical training warring with her practical nature. Finally, she nodded. It can be done. It won't be comfortable, and there's no margin for error, but it can be done. Ben's relief was so profound it brought tears to his eyes. I don't know how to thank you. Thank us by helping us survive the winter, Margaret replied pragmatically. 5 adults can accomplish more than 3. We'll need every hand working if we're going to stretch resources that far. Thomas was already pulling on his heaviest clothes and gathering rescue supplies. Ben, can you describe the exact layout of your property? Where the cellar is in relation to the house? What tools we'll need to move that beam? As Ben provided detailed instructions, Catherine felt a shift in the household's dynamic that had nothing to do with romantic complications or wounded feelings. They were no longer 3 people awkwardly sharing space. They were a survival unit preparing for a life-or-death mission. Margaret packed medical supplies and emergency provisions, while Catherine prepared a recovery area near the fireplace with extra blankets and heated stones. The careful boundaries and schedules that had governed their previous days disappeared, replaced by urgent cooperation focused on saving lives. The rope system worked for getting Ben here, Thomas said, testing the knots that would keep him connected to the house. But I'll need something longer to reach the Anderson place and back. Margaret produced clothesline and additional rope from her organized storage areas. This should give you enough length, but you'll need to secure intermediate anchor points. Find sturdy trees or fence posts to attach secondary lines, Catherine watched the preparations with growing anxiety. The plan was logical, but it required Thomas and Ben to navigate 6 miles of storm-lashed terrain to reach a damaged homestead, then perform a rescue operation before making the return journey with a woman and infant in tow. "What if the cellar has collapsed further?" she asked. "What if they can't free Sarah and the baby?" Ben's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "Then we dig them out by hand if we have to. Sarah's survived this long. She's stronger than any of us realized." Thomas shouldered his pack of tools and emergency supplies. "If we're not back by tomorrow evening, assume the worst. Don't risk anyone else trying to follow us." "You'll be back," Margaret said firmly, "because the alternative is unacceptable." Catherine impulsively stepped forward and grabbed Thomas's arm. "Be careful, both of you. We need you to come home." The word home slipped out before she could stop it, and Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. This wasn't her home in any legal or traditional sense, but somehow it had become the place. She belonged, the place where people she cared about lived and worked and struggled together. Thomas met her eyes for a moment, and Catherine saw something there that hadn't been present in their earlier interactions, a recognition of genuine partnership that transcended their complicated romantic situation. "We'll be back," he promised, "all of us." The 2 men disappeared into the storm, their figures swallowed by blowing snow within seconds of leaving the porch. Catherine and Margaret stood at the window, watching the landscape for any sign of movement, though they knew they wouldn't see the rescue party again until they returned. "Now we wait," Margaret said quietly, but waiting proved more difficult than either woman had anticipated. Without the distraction of normal household routines, they found themselves pacing, checking supplies, and starting conversations that neither could finish. The house felt enormous and claustrophobic at the same time. "Tell me about Sarah Anderson," Catherine said finally, settling into a chair near the fire. "What should we expect when they bring her here?" Margaret considered the question, while mending one of Thomas's workshirts. "Sarah's a good woman, but she's been struggling since the baby was born. The isolation out here is hard on young mothers, especially during winter months. She may be fragile when they arrive." "Fragile how?" "Depression, anxiety, fear of being separated from her baby. Women who've survived traumatic situations sometimes have difficulty trusting that they're truly safe, even when the immediate danger has passed." Catherine nodded, filing away the information. She'd never been around infants or dealt with trauma beyond her own experiences, but she was determined to be helpful rather than an additional burden. "What about space?" she asked. "Where will they sleep?" Margaret had clearly been thinking about the same logistical challenges. "The parlor can accommodate Sarah and the baby. Ben can sleep in the barn with Thomas, at least initially. Once we know more about their situation, we can work out better arrangements." The afternoon stretched into evening with no sign of the rescue party's return. Catherine prepared a large pot of soup that could be easily reheated whenever they arrived, while Margaret organized medical supplies and infant care items she'd gathered from various storage areas. "You've done this before," Catherine observed, watching Margaret's efficient preparations, "cared for new mothers and babies." "Dr. Hamilton delivered several babies during the typhoid outbreak," Margaret replied. "The regular midwife had died early in the epidemic, so I learned by necessity. It's not the same as being trained, but I know enough to help if there are complications." As night fell and the storm continued its relentless assault, both women found themselves straining to hear sounds from outside that might indicate the rescue party's return. Every wind gust sounded like voices, every creak of the house like footsteps on the porch. "They should be back by now," Catherine said, voicing the fear they'd both been trying to ignore. Margaret set down her mending and moved to the window, though there was nothing to see in the darkness beyond. Travel takes longer in these conditions than you'd expect. They might have decided to wait out the worst of the storm at the Anderson place before attempting the return journey. But Catherine could hear the uncertainty in Margaret's voice. They were both imagining scenarios too terrible to speak aloud. The rescue party lost in the storm, Sarah and the baby beyond saving, Thomas and Ben joining the list of winter casualties that every frontier community accumulated. It was nearly midnight when they finally heard it, the sound of multiple voices calling through the wind, followed by heavy footsteps on the porch. Catherine and Margaret rushed to open the door, revealing a sight that made Catherine's heart leap with relief and break with sympathy simultaneously. Thomas and Ben were supporting a woman wrapped in every blanket and coat they'd been able to find. Sarah Anderson was conscious but clearly exhausted, her face pale with cold and stress. Most remarkably, she clutched a bundle against her chest that occasionally emitted the thin, precious sound of a baby's cry. "Get them inside," Margaret commanded, immediately shifting into medical mode. "Catherine, clear the parlor and get the stones reheated. We need to warm them gradually." As they helped the Anderson family into the house, Catherine felt a profound sense of completion she couldn't quite explain. The household that had begun as an awkward triangle of romantic confusion had evolved into something far more meaningful. A refuge where people saved each other's lives simply because it was the right thing to do. The winter ahead would test all of them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, but tonight they had proven something important about their capacity to choose compassion over convenience, cooperation over conflict. They were no longer strangers sharing space until spring. They had become a family forged by necessity and strengthened by choice. Sarah Anderson hadn't spoken a complete sentence in the 4 days since her rescue. She sat in the parlor corner with baby Emma clutched against her chest, her eyes following every movement in the room with the hyper-vigilant intensity of someone who'd learned that safety could vanish in an instant. When anyone approached too quickly or spoke too loudly, she would curl protectively around her daughter and turn toward the wall. "She's not sleeping," Margaret confided to Catherine during their morning chores. "I can hear her moving around all night, checking on the baby, listening for sounds that might mean danger. She's exhausting herself." Catherine watched Sarah through the parlor doorway, noting how the young mother's hands shook when she tried to eat or drink. The woman who'd survived being trapped underground for hours was now struggling with the aftermath of trauma that seemed to grow worse rather than better with each passing day. "Maybe she needs to feel useful," Catherine suggested. "Right now she's just existing, being taken care of. That might be making her feel more helpless." Margaret considered this, while kneading bread dough with perhaps more force than necessary. The addition of 3 more people to their household had multiplied the domestic workload exponentially, and even with Ben helping where he could, the women were struggling to keep up with basic necessities. "What kind of useful?" Margaret asked. "She can barely hold a conversation, let alone take on household responsibilities." Catherine had been thinking about this problem for days, watching Sarah's interactions with her baby and noting the moments when the young mother seemed most at peace. "She's good with Emma, natural, confident. What if we made her the one in charge of all the children's needs?" "Emma's the only child here," Margaret pointed out. "For now," Catherine replied quietly. "But Margaret, you're pregnant, and we don't know what other neighbors might need help before spring ends. Sarah could become our childcare expert, the person everyone turns to when children are involved." Margaret's hands stilled in the bread dough. They hadn't discussed Margaret's pregnancy directly since that first awkward evening, though it was becoming increasingly obvious as her condition progressed. The practical implications of bringing a baby into their already strained household had been carefully avoided by everyone. "That's actually not a terrible idea," Margaret admitted. "Give her authority over something important. Make her feel needed rather than just sheltered." Their conversation was interrupted by raised voices from outside. Through the kitchen window, they could see Thomas and Ben in heated discussion near the barn, their body language suggesting disagreement about something significant. Catherine dried her hands and stepped onto the porch, Margaret following despite the cold. The men's voices carried clearly across the yard, their argument apparently too urgent for discretion. "Told you it's too dangerous," Thomas was saying. "The wolves have been getting bolder every day. Yesterday I counted at least 6 different tracks around the chicken coop. And I'm telling you, we don't have a choice," Ben replied, his voice tight with frustration. "Our food stores won't last until spring unless we supplement them. You know it, I know it, and the women know it even if they're not saying so." Catherine felt her stomach drop. Margaret's careful calculations had been based on normal winter conditions and predictable consumption patterns. But nothing about their situation was normal, and the stress of overcrowding, trauma recovery, and an infant's needs was taking a toll on everyone's appetite and energy levels. "What are you two arguing about?" Margaret called from the porch. Thomas and Ben exchanged glances, clearly reluctant to involve the women in what they considered men's concerns. But Catherine was tired of being protected from unpleasant realities. "Tell us," she said firmly. "We're all in this together. No more keeping the women in the dark about survival decisions." Ben sighed, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "The game situation is worse than we expected. Normal winter hunting spots are empty. The hard freeze drove most animals to lower elevations or into deeper forest areas. To find enough meat to feed 6 people through spring, I'd need to venture into territory that's problematic." "Problematic how?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Wolf territory," Thomas replied grimly. "They're hunting in larger packs this winter, probably because the same conditions affecting our food supply are affecting theirs. Ben's talking about going into areas where wolves have established den sites and feeding grounds." Margaret wrapped her arms around herself. Whether from cold or anxiety, Catherine couldn't tell. "How much additional food do we actually need?" Ben pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, covered with the same kind of careful calculations Margaret had been making. "If we continue at current consumption levels, we'll run out of protein by mid-February. We might be able to stretch other supplies until March, but you can't survive Montana winter without adequate protein," Margaret finished, "especially not with a nursing mother and a pregnant woman in the household." The blunt acknowledgement of their physical realities hung in the cold air between them. Catherine realized that their rescue of the Anderson family, while morally necessary, had created survival pressures none of them had fully anticipated. "What about fishing?" she asked. "The creek must have fish even in winter." "Ice fishing requires specialized equipment we don't have," Thomas explained, "and the yields are unpredictable. We might catch enough for one meal, or we might come back empty-handed after spending a full day outside in dangerous cold." Sarah Anderson appeared in the doorway behind them, Emma bundled against her chest. Catherine was surprised to see her up and moving around. Since the rescue, Sarah had rarely left her corner of the parlor. "I can help," Sarah said quietly, her voice rusty from disuse but determined. "With the hunting, I know techniques my father taught me before I married Ben." Ben stared at his wife in shock. "Sarah, you're barely recovered from the accident. And with Emma and I both need food to survive," Sarah replied with more firmness than Catherine had heard from her since the rescue. "I can't contribute to our safety by hiding in the parlor and being afraid of everything." Margaret stepped forward, her medical training clearly warring with her recognition of Sarah's need to regain agency. "What kind of hunting techniques?" Sarah shifted Emma to a more comfortable position, the movement revealing a confidence that had been hidden beneath her trauma responses. "Trap lines for small game. My father ran them during lean years, said they were more reliable than tracking large animals in winter conditions." Less dangerous too, since you're not challenging predators for territory. Thomas and Ben exchanged surprised looks. Neither had apparently considered small game trapping as a viable option. Rabbit, squirrel, prairie dog, Sarah continued, warming to the subject. Birds, if you know how to construct the right snares. It's not as much meat per catch as deer or elk, but it's steady, predictable, and doesn't require going into wolf country. Catherine felt a surge of admiration for the young woman who'd seemed so broken just days earlier. Sarah wasn't just offering to help, she was providing expertise none of them had known existed in their group. "You'd be willing to teach us?" Margaret asked. "I'd be willing to do it myself," Sarah corrected, "with help. But I know the techniques, I know what to look for, and I'm not afraid of working outdoors." Ben looked torn between pride in his wife's strength and concern for her welfare. "Sarah, the cold alone is something I've dealt with my entire life," Sarah interrupted. "Ben, I appreciate you wanting to protect me, but protection isn't the same as survival. If we're going to make it through this winter, everyone needs to contribute what they can." Catherine saw Margaret nodding approvingly and realized that Sarah's emergence from traumatic paralysis was exactly what their household had needed. Not just another person to feed and shelter, but another capable adult with skills that could keep them all alive. "How quickly could you set up trap lines?" Thomas asked, his practical nature overcoming his initial skepticism. Sarah considered the question seriously. 3 days to scout locations and construct the traps, another day to set them up properly, after that checking them daily, resetting, as needed. If the locations are good, we should start seeing catches within a week. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made everyone freeze. The distant howling of wolves, closer than any of them had heard before. The howls were answered by others, creating a chorus that seemed to surround the homestead. Emma began crying at the sound, and Sarah automatically began the swaying motion that mothers use to calm frightened babies. But her eyes remained alert and focused as she listened to the wolf song. "Pack hunting," she said matter-of-factly. "They're coordinating a hunt, probably for elk or deer. We'll want to avoid the areas where they're most active." Thomas stared at her with newfound respect. "You can tell that from their howls?" "You can tell a lot from wolf behavior if you know how to listen," Sarah replied. "Where they're hunting, how many are in the pack, whether they're desperate or just opportunistic. My father trapped wolves for bounty when I was young. I learned to read their patterns." Catherine felt something shifting in the group dynamic that went beyond Sarah's emergence from trauma. The young woman wasn't just recovering her confidence. She was revealing knowledge and skills that could transform their survival prospects. "Sarah," Margaret said slowly, "what other things did your father teach you that we might not know about?" Sarah's smile was small but genuine, the first Catherine had seen from her since the rescue. "Quite a few things, actually. Weather prediction, edible plants that survive winter conditions, ways to preserve meat without salt. He believed in preparing for worst-case scenarios." Ben laughed, a sound of relief and surprise. 20 years of marriage, and I'm still learning things about your family." 10 years, Sarah corrected gently. "We've been married 10 years, Ben. But yes, my father had unconventional ideas about what young women should learn." As the wolf howls faded into the distance, Catherine looked around at their little group and realized that everything was changing again. Sarah's recovery was bringing new capabilities and possibilities to their survival efforts, but it was also revealing how much they still didn't know about each other. The household that had begun as a romantic triangle evolved into a rescue mission and transformed into a survival unit, was becoming something else entirely. A true partnership where each person's unique knowledge and skills were essential to everyone's welfare. But even as Catherine felt optimistic about their improving prospects, she couldn't shake the awareness that winter was far from over. The wolves prowling around their homestead were a reminder that they were living in a landscape where human survival was never guaranteed, where one mistake or bit of bad luck could undo all their careful planning and cooperation. The test of whether they could truly function as a family wouldn't come from learning to share domestic space or divide household chores. It would come from discovering whether they could trust each other completely when life and death decisions had to be made in situations none of them could predict or control. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the promise of more snow and the scent of predators moving through territory that might belong to wolves and humans alike. Winter was teaching them all lessons they'd never expected to learn. Sarah's trap lines proved more successful than anyone had dared hope. Within 2 weeks, she was bringing home a steady supply of rabbits, squirrels, and the occasional fox, supplementing their dwindling stores with fresh meat that made the difference between mere survival and maintaining strength through the brutal Montana winter. But success came with an unexpected price that none of them had anticipated. Catherine discovered the problem on a February morning when she followed Sarah's tracks to check the farthest trap line. She found Sarah kneeling in the snow beside a triggered trap, but instead of collecting her catch, she was crying with quiet, desperate sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. "Sarah," Catherine approached carefully, mindful of the fragile emotional balance that trauma survivors often maintained. "What's wrong?" Sarah looked up with eyes red-rimmed from cold and tears. In her hands was a young rabbit, its neck cleanly broken by the trap's mechanism. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "Every morning I come out here hoping the traps will be empty. Every morning I have to kill something that was just trying to survive winter, same as us." Catherine knelt beside her in the snow, understanding with sudden clarity the psychological burden that Sarah had taken on without any of them considering the emotional cost. They'd been so focused on the practical necessity of supplementing their food supply that they'd ignored what it meant for one person to become responsible for taking lives daily. "You've been doing this alone for 2 weeks, Catherine said quietly. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because we need the food," Sarah replied, wiping her eyes with snow-covered mittens. "Because everyone's depending on me to provide protein. That keeps us alive. Because there's no one else who knows how to do this." Catherine helped Sarah transfer the rabbit to their carrying sack, noting how the young woman's hands shook with each motion. "That doesn't mean you have to carry the whole burden yourself. We can take turns checking traps, share the responsibility. It's not just the killing," Sarah continued as they moved to the next trap location. "It's having to be the person everyone looks to for survival skills. Everyone treats me like I'm some kind of frontier expert, but half the things I suggest are guesses based on childhood memories. What if I'm wrong? What if my advice gets someone killed?" The revelation stopped Catherine short. She'd assumed that Sarah's confident emergence from trauma meant the young woman was emotionally ready to handle the leadership role they'd thrust upon her. Instead, Sarah had been struggling with imposter syndrome while forcing herself to function because lives depended on her knowledge. "Has anyone pressured you to take on more than you're comfortable with?" Catherine asked. Sarah was quiet for several minutes as they continued along the trap line. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a complexity of emotions Catherine hadn't expected, not pressured exactly. "But Thomas and Margaret have been asking me about things I'm not sure about. Weather prediction techniques my father mentioned but never really taught me. Plant identification that might help Margaret's pregnancy, but could be dangerous if I remember wrong. Even Ben's started treating me like I have answers. I don't really." They reached the next trap to find it empty, which seemed to provide Sarah with more relief than disappointment. As they reset the mechanism, Catherine began to understand the larger pattern that was developing within their household. Everyone's been putting pressure on everyone else. Catherine realized aloud. I've been trying to solve problems I know nothing about. Margaret's been taking on medical responsibilities without proper training. Thomas has been making survival decisions based on incomplete information, and I've been pretending to know more than I do, because admitting ignorance might get people killed, Sarah finished. We're all just making it up as we go along and hoping we're right. The honesty was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Catherine had been feeling inadequate compared to what seemed like everyone else's competence and expertise. Learning that Sarah, who appeared most capable, was also struggling with uncertainty, made the burden feel more shared. What do we do about it? Catherine asked. I don't know, Sarah admitted with a rueful smile, but maybe that's the first step. Admitting when we don't know instead of pretending we do. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of someone calling their names across the winter landscape. They looked up to see Ben trudging through the snow toward them, his expression urgent enough to suggest something more serious than routine communication. Catherine! Sarah! He called. You need to get back to the house. Margaret's having problems. They abandoned the remaining trap checks and hurried back through the snow. Sarah's concerns about emotional burdens temporarily pushed aside by immediate crisis. They found Margaret in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the table while Thomas hovered nearby with the helpless expression of a man facing a situation completely outside his experience. Contractions, Margaret said through gritted teeth. They started about an hour ago, much too early. I'm only 7 months along. Catherine felt panic rise in her throat. She'd never dealt with pregnancy complications, and premature labor in their isolated circumstances could be catastrophic for both mother and baby. What can we do? She asked, looking between Margaret and Sarah. I don't know, Margaret replied, with frightening honesty. Dr. Hamilton taught me to assist with normal births, but premature labor, the complications. I don't have the knowledge or equipment to handle what might go wrong. Sarah immediately moved to Margaret's side, her earlier emotional crisis set aside in favor of immediate action. What did Dr. Hamilton tell you about stopping early labor? Bed rest, minimize stress, warm baths if available, Margaret recited. But if it's true labor instead of false contractions. She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood the implications. A baby born 2 months early in 1892, Montana had minimal chances of survival, and the birth itself could threaten Margaret's life as well. Thomas stood at the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape, as if seeking solutions in the endless, white. The roads to town are still impassable. Even if we could get word to Dr. Hamilton, he couldn't reach us until spring. Then we handle this ourselves, Catherine said with more confidence than she felt. Sarah, what do you remember about difficult births from your father's teaching? Some things, Sarah replied carefully. Basic principles about positioning, breathing, keeping the mother warm and calm. But Catherine, premature births are different. The baby might not be able to breathe properly, might not be able to regulate body temperature. Margaret's face was pale, but determined as another contraction gripped her. If this baby is coming early, we need to prepare for keeping a very small infant alive without medical equipment. Body heat, constant feeding, protection from infection. Catherine felt the weight of responsibility settling on all of them like a physical burden. They were about to attempt something that trained medical professionals sometimes failed at, with improvised materials and limited knowledge. Ben, she said, turning to the man who'd been standing quietly in the doorway, we need the house as warm as possible. Can you help Thomas with extra firewood and sealing any drafts? Already on it, Ben replied, clearly grateful for a concrete task he could handle. Sarah, can you help me set up a birthing area, clean linens, hot water, whatever medical supplies Margaret has available? What about Emma? Sarah asked, suddenly realizing that her infant daughter would need care during what could be a lengthy and stressful labor. Thomas spoke up from his position by the window. "I'll take care of Emma. Keep her fed and entertained in the parlor while you focus on Margaret." The sight of a weathered rancher volunteering for infant care would have been amusing under different circumstances, but Catherine felt only gratitude for his willingness to help however he could. As they began preparations for what might be the most challenging situation they'd faced all winter, Catherine realized that their household had reached another transformation point. The romantic triangle that had brought her to Montana seemed like ancient history compared to the life-and-death medical crisis they were about to navigate together. "Margaret," she said, as they helped the pregnant woman toward the bedroom, "what are the chances that this is false labor, that the contractions might stop if we can keep you calm and rested?" Margaret's smile was wan but genuine. "Honestly, I have no idea. First pregnancies are unpredictable under the best circumstances, and these aren't the best circumstances." As Margaret's next contraction built in intensity, Catherine found herself praying to whatever forces might be listening that their improvised medical team would be sufficient for whatever challenges the next hours would bring. Outside, the wind began picking up again, and Catherine could hear the distant howling of wolves that seemed to sense vulnerability in the human settlement. Inside, 5 adults and 1 infant were about to discover whether their bonds of mutual dependence were strong enough to sustain them through a crisis that would test every assumption they'd made about survival, cooperation, and the lengths people would go to save each other's lives. The winter that had already taught them so much about themselves was preparing to deliver its most difficult lesson yet. Margaret's labor lasted 18 hours, during which time the storm outside escalated into the worst blizzard they'd experienced all winter. The wind howled with supernatural fury, shaking the house's foundation and sending snow through every crack and crevice that Ben and Thomas hadn't managed to seal. But inside the master bedroom, time seemed suspended in a bubble of focused determination, where 5 people worked together to bring new life into an unforgiving world. Catherine had never witnessed birth before, and the reality proved both more frightening and more miraculous than anything she could have imagined. Margaret labored with the stoic determination of a frontier woman who understood that complaint was a luxury she couldn't afford, while Sarah provided guidance based on half-remembered conversations with her father and practical knowledge gleaned from farm animals. "The baby's positioning isn't ideal," Sarah said quietly during one of Margaret's brief rests between contractions. "Breech presentation, which means the feet will come first instead of the head." Catherine felt her stomach clench with new fear. "Is that dangerous?" "It can be," Margaret answered for herself, her voice strained but steady. "Breech births have higher risks of complications, especially for premature babies. The umbilical cord can become compressed, cutting off oxygen to the baby." Thomas appeared in the doorway, Emma sleeping peacefully in his arms, despite the chaos surrounding them. "How much longer?" he asked, his face creased with worry that went beyond normal concern for neighbors. "Could be minutes, could be hours," Sarah replied honestly. "Breech presentations don't follow predictable timelines." Catherine noticed the way Thomas looked at Margaret during contractions, saw the pain that crossed his features as his wife struggled with complications that could cost her life. Whatever romantic confusion had existed between the 3 of them seemed insignificant compared to the raw emotion of a man watching the woman he'd loved and lost and found again fight for survival. The next contraction brought visible progress, and Sarah's expression grew more focused. "I can see the baby's feet. Margaret, with the next contraction, you need to push as hard as you can manage." What followed was a series of minutes that felt like hours, as Margaret summoned strength from somewhere deep within herself, while Sarah worked to guide the baby. safely into the world. Catherine held Margaret's hand, feeling bones grind together with the force of contractions that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Finally, with a rush of fluid and Margaret's exhausted cry, Sarah lifted a tiny, blue-tinged baby who seemed too small and still to be viable. For a terrifying moment, silence filled the room, except for Margaret's labored breathing and the storm's continued assault outside. Then Sarah turned the baby upside down and delivered a sharp pat to its back, producing a thin, reedy cry that was the most beautiful sound Catherine had ever heard. "It's a boy," Sarah announced, wrapping the infant in warm cloths they'd prepared. "Small, but breathing and responsive. He's got a fighting chance." Margaret collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted, but smiling through tears of relief and joy. "Let me see him." Catherine helped position the tiny bundle against Margaret's chest, noting how the baby's entire body could fit in his mother's two hands. He was frighteningly small, with translucent skin and delicate features that spoke of his premature arrival. But his eyes were alert, and his cry grew stronger as he warmed against his mother's body. "He needs to stay warm constantly," Sarah said, checking the baby's breathing and color. "Premature infants can't regulate their own body temperature. He'll need skin-to-skin contact, frequent feeding, and protection from any drafts or temperature changes." Thomas stepped closer, his expression soft with wonder as he looked at the newest member of their household. "What will you name him?" Margaret looked up at the faces surrounding her. Thomas, Catherine, Sarah, and Ben, all of whom had risked their own comfort and safety to help bring her son safely into the world. "David," she said quietly. "David Mitchell, after my father. But also because it means beloved. This child is already beloved by more people than I ever expected." Catherine felt tears sting her eyes at the name choice and its implications. Margaret wasn't just naming her son. She was acknowledging the family they'd all become, the bonds that had formed through shared struggle and mutual dependence. The celebration was interrupted by Ben's urgent voice from the main room. "Thomas, you need to see this!" Thomas reluctantly left the bedroom, returning minutes later with an expression that combined amazement and concern. "The storm has damaged part of the barn roof. It's not catastrophic, but we're losing heat, and some of our hay stores are getting wet." Catherine felt the familiar weight of crisis settling over them again. A newborn baby required stable warmth and clean conditions, but their shelter was compromised by the same storm that had complicated his birth. "How much damage?" Sarah asked, automatically shifting into problem-solving mode, despite her exhaustion from assisting with the delivery. "Maybe a quarter of the roof over the livestock area," Ben reported. "The animals are still sheltered, but barely, and if the storm continues like this, the damage could spread." Margaret struggled to sit up, her maternal instincts overriding her physical exhaustion. "We can't lose our livestock. Without the cattle and horses, we won't survive until spring." "You're not going anywhere," Catherine said firmly, gently pushing Margaret back down. "You just gave birth to a premature baby. Your job is to rest and keep David healthy." "Then what do we do about the barn?" Thomas asked. Catherine looked around the room at their improvised family, each person exhausted from the night's crisis, but ready to face whatever challenge came next. "We fix it. All of us who can work safely in this weather." "Catherine, none of us are skilled. Roofers," Sarah pointed out, "and working on a roof during a blizzard is dangerous." "Yes," Catherine agreed. "But letting our livestock freeze to death is also dangerous. We figure out how to minimize the risk while doing what needs to be done." She realized as she spoke that something fundamental had shifted in her role within the household. She was no longer the outsider seeking acceptance or the mail-order bride caught in an awkward triangle. She'd become the person others looked to for decisive leadership when immediate action was required. Thomas nodded slowly, recognizing the same leadership emergence. "What do you suggest?" Catherine thought quickly, weighing risks against necessities. Sarah and I work together to care for Margaret and both babies. You and Ben assess the barn damage and determine what materials we have available for repairs. We don't attempt to fix everything at once, just enough to get through this storm. What about after the storm? Ben asked. If there's structural damage that needs proper repair work, we'll face that when we get there, Catherine replied. Right now, our priority is keeping everyone alive through the next 24 hours. As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, baby David began crying with the thin, demanding wail of a newborn who needed frequent feeding and constant attention. Margaret immediately moved to nurse him, but her exhaustion was obvious, and Catherine realized that caring for a premature infant would require more energy than one woman could provide alone. Sarah, can you show me how to help with infant care? Catherine asked. Margaret's going to need support, especially if the baby requires feeding every few hours. Of course, Sarah replied, settling Emma into a makeshift cradle they'd prepared. Premature babies often have trouble nursing efficiently, so we may need to supplement with other feeding methods. Thomas and Ben gathered their heaviest coats and headed back outside to assess the barn situation, leaving the women to establish routines that would keep both babies healthy while supporting Margaret's recovery. As Catherine learned to change tiny diapers and recognize different types of infant cries, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd come to Montana seeking a practical marriage arrangement that would provide security and purpose. Instead, she'd found something far more complex and meaningful. A family bound together not by legal documents or romantic love, but by the daily choice to put each other's welfare above personal comfort. The storm outside continued its assault on their shelter, but inside, 6 adults and 2 infants worked together to create warmth, safety, and the kind of mutual support that made survival possible in an environment designed to kill the unprepared. Margaret dozed between feedings while David slept against her chest, his tiny form rising and falling with each precious breath. Sarah organized supplies and checked on both babies with the careful attention of someone who understood how quickly infant health could change. Catherine found herself moving between tasks with growing confidence, no longer questioning her right to make decisions that affected everyone's welfare. When Thomas and Ben returned from the barn, covered with snow and grim with exhaustion, their report was sobering but not catastrophic. We've managed a temporary fix, Thomas said, accepting the hot coffee Catherine handed him. Enough to protect the animals through this storm, but we'll need to do major repairs when weather permits, and we'll need materials we don't currently have. What kind of materials? Margaret asked from the bedroom doorway, where she stood holding David while he slept. Lumber, roofing materials, proper tools for structural work, Ben replied. Things we'd normally get from town or trade with neighbors. Catherine felt the familiar challenge of frontier life settling over them again. Every solution seemed to create new problems. Every crisis revealed additional vulnerabilities they hadn't anticipated. But as she looked around their crowded, chaotic household, Thomas and Ben planning repair strategies, Sarah organizing medical supplies, Margaret nursing her newborn son, Emma sleeping peacefully despite the surrounding commotion, Catherine realized that their ability to handle whatever came next had grown exponentially. They weren't just surviving winter anymore. They were thriving despite conditions that would have defeated them individually. The mail-order bride arrangement that had brought her to Montana had evolved into something none of them could have planned, but all of them had learned to value. Above conventional definitions of family or home, outside, the storm was beginning to show signs of weakening, though snow continued to fall with steady persistence. Inside, 2 babies breathed steadily in the warmth their extended family had created through cooperation, determination, and the kind of love that emerges when people choose to protect each other simply because it's the right thing to do. Spring was still months away, but for the first time since arriving in Montana, Catherine felt certain they would all see it together. April arrived like a whispered promise, with morning temperatures that finally climbed above freezing, and the first brave shoots of grass pushing through patches of melting snow. Catherine stood on the front porch, holding 3-month-old David, while Emma toddled around the yard, chasing butterflies that had emerged from their winter hiding places. The sight of growing things and warming air felt like a miracle after the brutal months they'd endured together. The household had found rhythms over the winter that none of them had expected. Margaret had recovered from childbirth with remarkable strength, but the demands of nursing a premature infant had required everyone to adapt their roles. Thomas had become surprisingly skilled at infant care, often walking the floor with David during night feedings while Margaret rested. Sarah had evolved into their unofficial household manager, coordinating schedules and resource allocation with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to think 3 steps ahead. Catherine had discovered that her role as crisis leader during emergencies had gradually expanded into serving as the family's primary decision-maker for long-term planning. When disputes arose about resource allocation or work assignments, everyone seemed to naturally turn to her for resolution. It was a responsibility she'd never sought, but had grown into through necessity and mutual trust. The road to town should be passable within the week, Ben announced, returning from his morning survey of the creek crossing. Water's running high from snowmelt, but the bridge is holding, and the worst of the mud has started to dry out. The prospect of reconnecting with the outside world after months of isolation brought a mixture of excitement and anxiety to everyone. They'd become so accustomed to their self-contained existence that the idea of interacting with neighbors and townspeople felt almost foreign. "Dr. Hamilton will want to examine David," Margaret said, settling into a chair with her mending while the baby slept against Catherine's shoulder. "Make sure his development is progressing normally despite the premature birth." Catherine felt the tiny weight of the infant and marveled at how much he'd grown since that terrifying February night. David was still small for his age, but he was alert, responsive, and thriving under the collective care of 6 adults who'd learned to anticipate his every need. "What about the barn repairs?" Thomas asked, studying the structure that had sheltered their livestock through winter, despite significant storm damage. "We'll need to coordinate with other homesteaders for materials and skilled labor." The practical considerations of spring were complicated by questions none of them had addressed during their survival-focused winter months. Legal questions about property ownership, social questions about their unconventional living arrangement, and personal questions about relationships that had evolved far beyond their original intentions. "There's something we need to discuss," Catherine said, settling David into his cradle before joining the others around the kitchen table, "about what happens now that we can leave if we want to." The words hung in the air between them, acknowledging the reality that winter's end meant the end of their forced cohabitation. Catherine had the legal right to return to Chicago or seek her fortune elsewhere. Sarah, Ben, and Emma could rebuild their destroyed homestead or relocate to family in other territories. Even Margaret and Thomas would need to navigate the complex legalities of their marriage and property ownership. Thomas looked around the table at faces that had become as familiar as his own reflection. "I need to say something first. About the letters I wrote to Catherine and the circumstances that brought us all together." Catherine felt her pulse quicken, uncertain whether Thomas was about to apologize again for his deception or make some declaration about their future that would complicate the delicate balance they'd achieved. "I was wrong," Thomas continued, "to present myself as someone I wasn't. Wrong to seek a replacement wife instead of investigating whether Margaret was truly dead. Wrong to create a situation that could have hurt both of you. He paused, meeting Catherine's eyes directly. But I can't regret the outcome. This family we've built together has become more important to me than any legal arrangement or social convention. Margaret reached across the table to clasp Thomas's hand, the first deliberately intimate gesture Catherine had witnessed between them since her arrival. We've all made mistakes this winter. I was wrong to blame Catherine for responding to your letters when she had no way of knowing the truth. Wrong to resent her presence when she'd done nothing except try to build a better life for herself. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at Margaret's words. The forgiveness she hadn't dared hope for was being offered freely, without conditions or expectations. What are you both saying? Catherine asked quietly. We're saying we want you to stay, Margaret replied firmly, not as hired help or a charity case, but as family, as the woman who helped birth my son, who kept us all alive through the worst winter any of us have experienced, who became the leader we needed when everything seemed impossible. Sarah looked up from bouncing Emma on her knee. Ben and I have been talking too, about rebuilding our homestead versus staying here. The truth is, this arrangement has worked better than anything we could have achieved on our own. We've accomplished more as a group than we ever did as separate families. Ben nodded agreement. The barn repairs alone would take me months working by myself. The trap lines, the food preservation, the childcare, everything's been easier with more hands and different skills. Catherine felt overwhelmed by the convergence of acceptance and invitation. But what would that look like? Legally? Socially? How do we explain to neighbors and townspeople that we're choosing to live together when we're not related by blood or marriage? We tell them the truth, Thomas said simply, that we're a family by choice, bound together by mutual respect and shared responsibility, that we've learned to depend on each other in ways that matter more than conventional relationships. Margaret smiled, the expression transforming her face with genuine warmth. Besides, frontier communities have seen stranger arrangements. Survival makes its own rules and success speaks for itself. Catherine looked around the table at faces that had become dear to her in ways she couldn't have imagined when she first stepped off the train in Copper Falls. Emma was babbling happily in Sarah's arms, David slept peacefully in his cradle, and 5 adults who'd been strangers 8 months earlier were proposing to formalize bonds that winter had forged between them. There's one more thing, Margaret said, her cheeks coloring slightly. Something I need to tell everyone before we make any permanent decisions. She glanced at Thomas, some communication passing between them that Catherine couldn't interpret. But that made Thomas's face light up with surprise and joy. I'm pregnant again, Margaret announced, about 6 weeks along, which means the baby would be born in November. The news hit the table like a boulder thrown into still water, creating ripples of shock, concern, and excitement that radiated through everyone present. So soon after David, Sarah asked, her medical concerns immediately apparent. Is that safe? Dr. Hamilton will need to monitor the pregnancy carefully, Margaret admitted. But yes, it's safe if I'm careful about nutrition and rest, and with all of you helping, she gestured around the table, I have more support than most frontier women ever dream of. Catherine felt a complex mixture of emotions at the news. Joy for Margaret and Thomas, excitement about another baby joining their household, but also a strange sense of completion she hadn't expected. The family they were building would include children, born into their unconventional arrangement, raised by multiple parents who'd chosen each other deliberately. Then it settled, Catherine said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. We stay together, all of us. We make this work not just for survival, but because we want to build something better than what any of us could achieve alone. Thomas stood up, extending his hand to Catherine in a gesture that felt formal and significant. Partners? Catherine shook his hand firmly, then found herself pulled into an embrace that included Margaret, then Sarah and Ben, then everyone gathering around David's cradle, while Emma laughed at the commotion. 2 weeks later, when the road to Copper Falls finally became fully passable, their first visitors were the Anderson neighbors who'd wondered about the family that had mysteriously survived winter better than anyone expected. Catherine watched through the kitchen window as Thomas and Ben showed off their successful livestock operation, their expanded garden plots, and the efficient workshop they'd built during the long winter evenings. Sarah demonstrated her trapline, techniques to wives who'd struggled to supplement their family's food supplies, while Margaret shared medical knowledge she'd gained from caring for a premature infant under primitive conditions. Catherine found herself describing organizational systems and resource management strategies that had evolved through trial and error but might help other families improve their own survival prospects. They're calling you the Mitchell Collective. Dr. Hamilton reported during his visit to examine David and confirm Margaret's new pregnancy. Some folks think it's scandalous, but most are impressed by what you've accomplished. Word spread all the way to Helena about the homestead where nobody went hungry last winter. Catherine laughed at the designation, recognizing that their success had indeed been collective in every sense. "What do you think, Doctor? Professional opinion on our arrangements?" Dr. Hamilton smiled while checking David's growth measurements. "My professional opinion is that this baby is thriving under care that exceeds what most infants receive. My personal opinion is that you've found something rare, a family structure that prioritizes welfare over convention. That's worth preserving." As spring progressed into summer, their household continued evolving in ways that felt natural rather than forced. Catherine took over most of the business correspondence and resource planning that kept their expanded operation running smoothly. Margaret focused on the medical knowledge that made her invaluable to neighboring families. Sarah managed their increasingly sophisticated food production and preservation systems. Thomas and Ben handled livestock, construction, and the heavy labor that maintained their infrastructure. The children, Emma and David, with another on the way, grew up surrounded by adults who shared responsibility for their safety, education, and happiness without questioning who had primary authority. Catherine realized that they were inadvertently creating a model for child rearing that went far beyond traditional nuclear family structures. On a warm July evening, as they all sat on the expanded porch, watching sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her from Chicago desperation to Montana fulfillment. She'd come west, seeking a practical arrangement with a stranger, and found instead a chosen family that redefined everything she'd thought she knew about love, commitment, and belonging. "Any regrets?" Margaret asked quietly, following Catherine's gaze toward the peaks that had sheltered them through their transformation. Catherine considered the question seriously, thinking about the life she'd left behind and the conventional marriage she'd originally sought. "Only one," she said finally. "I regret that it took so long to find my way here." Thomas raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To unconventional families and the winters that forge them." "To survival," Sarah added, "and the strength we find in each other." "To new beginnings," Ben contributed, "and second chances." "To the future," Margaret concluded, her hand resting on the new life growing within her. Catherine lifted her own cup, looking around at the faces that had become home in ways geography never could. "To family," she said simply, "however we choose to define it." Outside, the Montana wind carried the scent of growing things and the promise of seasons yet to come. Inside, 7 people who'd been brought together by circumstance had chosen to stay together by design, creating something stronger than any of them could have built alone. The mail-order bride who'd arrived in a November blizzard had found her, home at last, Not in marriage to a stranger, but in the revolutionary idea that family could be chosen, love could be multiplied rather than divided, and survival was just the beginning of what people could accomplish when they refused to accept conventional limitations on care, commitment, and community. As stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges future seasons might bring, they would face them together, bound not by law or tradition, but by the unbreakable ties of mutual choice and shared purpose that had sustained them through the longest winter of their lives and delivered them, whole and transformed, into spring. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.